The alien queen ordered his death, then she made him her king instead. He stood in the scorched remains of a once majestic throne room, wrists clamped in sleek, alien manacles. The thick walls were carved from obsidian-like stone, etched with glowing inscriptions that pulsed like living veins. Blue-green torches flickered along distant pillars, casting sharp, rippling light over a raised dais. On that dais sat the throne, impossibly tall, curved like a predatory beast's spine, and adorned with shimmering filaments that hummed with power. He refused to kneel, even though every muscle in his body ached after the battle that had led him here. He tilted his head, letting a slow smirk tug at the corner of his mouth, eyes narrowed in open defiance. Across the room, figures clad in armor reminiscent of blackened shells moved silently into formation, their weapons aimed at his heart. At the center of it all stood she who commanded every movement, every breath in this place. Her presence was magnetic, inescapable, a predator sizing up fresh prey. He felt the weight of her gaze like heat pressing against his skin. His own pulse hammered in his ears as he waited, tension coiling in the air, daring her to speak first. Her lips parted. A soft exhale, a moment's pause, like an invisible current passing between them. A faint luminescence danced across her skin, forming patterns he couldn't quite decipher. He fought the urge to shift under the intensity of that glowing stare. Then her voice sliced through the silence, rich and resonant, tinged with both amusement and threat. "On your knees, human!" She took one measured step forward, violet-black skin shimmering with each movement, as though her very flesh held living starlight. The shape of her eyes hinted at a beauty both lethal and intoxicating, and the predatory arch in her posture sent an involuntary jolt through his core. But he kept his footing, refusing to yield, savoring the quick flash of surprise that flickered in her alien gaze. He stayed silent, letting the breath tighten in his chest. The hush stretched, broken only by the hum of advanced weaponry and the low crackle of those eerie torches. At last he allowed himself a response. "I'd rather die standing." The manacles rattled against his wrists when he made a small gesture, as if daring her to make good on her threat. His tone was flat, but his eyes betrayed both fury and a spark of fascination at the woman before him. He had come here with a singular purpose: to avenge the fallen. Now, confronted by this alien queen whose empire had raised his homeworld, he found himself alive against all odds. That made her either arrogant or curious, or perhaps both. She surveyed him, her head tilted, the crown of her obsidian horns catching the torchlight. Flecks of deep gold rippled along the ridges of her neck and shoulders, and her attire, a long, form-fitting gown woven with alien metals, was as imposing as it was seductive. Her voice resonated in the pit of his stomach. "You speak as if I've given you a choice." Another step, and the floor beneath them seemed to vibrate with each measured stride. The armed guards shifted, wary, uncertain if they should intervene. She lifted a hand, and their weapons lowered by a fraction. Her luminous markings pulsed in time with her words. "You stand before Zyra, queen of the Tselic dominion. Resistance here is futile." His smirk widened. "Cade," he said, ignoring the severity of the situation. "Since we're sharing names, might as well learn the man you want dead." The dryness in his tone was a cold bravado that made the guards bristle. A few stepped forward, but she raised her hand again, halting them. It was clear who held supreme power in this chamber. He'd heard rumors of her beauty, her ruthlessness, the way she commanded armies that spanned star systems. He'd also heard stories of how her voice could bewitch or destroy, whichever she chose. Now he realized that none of the rumors had done her justice. She was living, lethal poetry. "Insolent," she murmured, gaze flicking from his manacles to the bruises peppering his arms. The faint glow at her collarbones brightened, spreading in intricate lines up the side of her throat. "Why should I give you the courtesy of death on your feet? You and your kind have spilled Tselic blood. Do you think defiance will grant you honor?" A silky note of challenge laced each word. He could sense her frustration dancing with her intrigue. She was used to subservience. He was the first to meet her eyes with the same lethal determination she wielded. He rolled one shoulder, testing the tension of his restraints. "Honor's overrated." I came here for something else. A slight tremor of pain darted across his features, quickly masked. Your forces torched my colony. Took everything from me. If you're going to kill me, do it. But don't expect me to kneel before the one who led the slaughter. Her lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. Interesting. She turned slightly, casting a glance at her closest advisors, tall, angular figures with the same shimmering complexion, though none as vibrantly patterned as her. They gazed back, silent, awaiting orders. She then looked again at Cade, scrutinizing him like a rare, unpredictable beast. I could snap your neck with a word, she mused. But perhaps there's more to be gained by keeping you alive. You survived where thousands did not. Let me see if you're worth the trouble. A flick of her hand, and the guard seized him, hauling him to his knees. He forced himself to remain relaxed, focusing on the moment, on not breaking eye contact with the Queen. Her presence washed over him in waves, a heady cocktail of pheromones and raw power. Every breath he took tasted like electricity, as if the air crackled with her mere existence. He'd faced monstrous creatures on the battlefield, but none had made his heart pound like this. If he were being honest, the fear was intertwined with something else, an attraction he refused to acknowledge. Throw him into the lower levels, she ordered, her voice dropping to a low pitch that rumbled through the chamber. Let him see what becomes of those who defy me. The guards dragged him away, and he didn't fight, though he glared at her over his shoulder as the alien corridors swallowed him. By the time he was locked in darkness, he caught one last look at her silhouette atop the dais, watching him with an intensity that promised their dance was only beginning. They chained him to a wall in a cell carved from the same strange stone. Bioluminescent moss clung to cracks in the surface, casting a faint glow. Time passed in a haze of pain and half-sleep. He had no idea if hours or days slipped by. The manacles bit into his wrists every time he moved, but he gritted his teeth, ignoring the sting. He'd been in worse prisons on other worlds, though none so alien. Occasional footsteps echoed in the corridor, and the distant hum of energy weapons reminded him he was far from rescue. Yet he was not left to rot entirely. When sustenance arrived, a small bowl of nutrient-rich paste, he devoured it, though it tasted like bitter algae. A curious guard would occasionally loom at the cell door, eyes flickering with the same faint luminescence, sometimes studying him as though he were a savage creature behind bars. Cade kept silent, swallowing curses and questions alike. He had only one goal: survive long enough to exploit any opening. If the Queen wanted to toy with him, he'd wait for the right moment to strike back. At last, the time came. The cell doors slid open. He flexed his shoulders, expecting a squadron of guards, but saw only two stepping inside. A smaller figure behind them, robed and hooded, carried a device that whirred with an eerie hum. The first guard, tall and plated in layered black armor, pressed a panel on the manacles. They sprang open, dropping Cade's arms. The sudden release of tension sent him staggering, but he caught himself. Before he could muster a quip, the second guard clamped a metal band around his neck. It tightened with a decisive snap, sending a jolt of discomfort down his spine. The robed figure stepped closer. Thin, pale hands emerged from the draping sleeves, adjusting the device. Cade felt warmth spread from the collar, traveling up the base of his skull. It took everything not to recoil. Then the figure murmured, voice muffled by the hood. Eurolink established. The words were clipped, businesslike. A wave of disorientation swept over him, and he clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to gasp. It felt as though invisible tendrils were brushing against the edges of his consciousness. Cade gritted his teeth as they dragged him into the corridor, half stumbling, half walking. The moment they cleared the threshold, he realized they weren't heading to an execution chamber. They were taking him upward, deeper into the fortress. Hall after hall, each one more lavish and intimidating than the last, passed in a blur of flickering alien script. He could sense the eyes of other Tsellic soldiers on him, some with open hostility, others with curiosity. The neural link tugged at his mind, as if a persistent hum resided at the back of his skull. They arrived at a wide set of double doors that parted to reveal a smaller audience chamber. Nowhere near as grand as the throne room, but still regal, with high ceilings and elaborate carvings along the walls. There she was, standing at the center, her presence dominating the space as if the entire room had been designed to worship her form. Zyra's luminous patterns glowed softly, matching the cool greenish hue of the overhead lights. Her expression was unreadable, but he caught the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth, as though satisfaction warred with curiosity. He halted a short distance away, forced to remain still by the guard's iron grips. She took a few leisurely steps toward him, circling as if inspecting new property. The collar's weight pressed on his neck. When she finally spoke, her voice resonated in perfect clarity through both the air and the subtle channel in his mind. "You're awake," she murmured. "Good. We'll see if your stubbornness proves useful." He let out a short bark of laughter, ignoring the fresh pang in his ribs. "So you didn't kill me? Should I be flattered or concerned?" She lifted one hand, trailing a slender finger across the collar. A ripple of energy skated through him, and his breath caught. "That depends on your cooperation," she said, each word balanced between threat and invitation. "You see, there's a complication. A rogue faction within my empire challenges my authority. They think I've gone soft, that I've let petty humans breathe too long." Her gaze bored into his. "I need leverage. You may prove valuable if you know anything about the rebels who aided your colony." Cade's heartbeat thundered. He knew more than a little. After all, he'd come here on a mission, though infiltration had turned into a bloodbath. But he refused to let her see any flicker of revelation. "All I know is how your armies butchered civilians and burned settlements," he growled. "Don't expect me to do your dirty work." She cocked her head, luminous eyes narrowing. The patterns along her shoulders flared, swirling with agitation and something else, interest. "You are nothing if not predictable, human." Her voice dipped. "But let me offer a different path. Survive my trials, help me destroy the traitors who threaten to tear my dominion apart, and you live." She leaned in, whisper light. "Fight me, and I promise your end will be slow." Her proximity was maddening. The air between them felt charged, as though she exhaled raw energy. His body reacted involuntarily, skin prickling as the collar pulsed. He maintained a mask of defiance, but he couldn't deny an undercurrent of tension flickering like sparks. He spat on the floor. "Why would I care about your empire?" Still, the flicker of an idea glimmered in the back of his mind. Allies were everything, even if this alliance was twisted and forced. He had an ulterior motive. Perhaps he could use her resources to dismantle Tselic forces from within. Or maybe he just wanted to see how this deadly game would play out. "And how do I know you won't kill me the moment I'm no longer useful?" Her lips curved, but the smile held no warmth. "You don't." She turned, addressing the guards with a sharp command. "Release him. Prepare a combat suit. If he tries to run, the collar will incapacitate him." Then, over her shoulder, she added softly to Cade. "You'll find that the more you fight me, the tighter my hold becomes. Make no mistake, you are mine to command." They unshackled his wrists, but the collar remained. He flexed his arms, rolling stiff shoulders. For a second, he met her gaze. Blue-green torches flickered behind her, illuminating her features in a seductive tapestry of shifting shadows and light. A trickle of something dangerously close to admiration ran through him. He brushed it aside. For her part, she maintained that elevated poise, an empress in total control. Yet beneath her composed exterior, he sensed an undercurrent of challenge, as if she relished locking horns with him. The tension between them had a pulse of its own, an electric thread tying them together despite their hatred. He followed the guards, half expecting an ambush around every corner. Instead, they led him to a polished corridor lined with gilded alcoves, each containing an ornate container or ceremonial item. Antechambers branched off to unknown depths. A faint hum trickled from overhead lights. Occasionally, smaller drones zipped through the air, scanning surfaces or adjusting panels. The place was alive with technology far beyond anything he'd seen, but the architecture retained a primal elegance that sent an uneasy flutter through his gut. They entered a small armory where alien suits hung along the walls. One of the guards grabbed a sleek set of dark plating and thrust it at him. "Dress," he said, his accent thick and rough compared to Zyra's fluid speech. Cade glanced around for privacy, found none, and decided he didn't care. He stripped off the tattered remnants of his own clothes, ignoring the guard's scrutiny, and started donning the alien gear. The plating clung to his body in a way that was both flexible and form-fitting, segments interlocking around his torso, arms, and legs. Tiny pricks of energy crackled at the seams, confirming a secure fit. He adjusted the chest piece, letting out a low hiss of pain when bruises flared across his ribs. The robed figure from earlier approached and attached a small device at the base of the collar. He recognized it as some kind of interface. "This suit is keyed to your neural link," the figure said in that same dry tone. "It will amplify your strength, monitor your vitals, and administer corrections if you disobey." A thin-lipped hint of grim satisfaction curved the figure's mouth. "Try not to fight it too much, or it may overload your system." Cade ground his teeth, forcing down a surge of anger. "I'm touched by your concern." He caught a flash of annoyance in the guard's eyes, but the robed figure said nothing, simply stepping aside with a quiet humility that seemed at odds with the fierce nature of this fortress. No further words were exchanged as they led him back out, deeper into the labyrinth. Soon, the corridor opened into a massive courtyard enclosed by towering walls. The ceiling arched high overhead, constructed of reinforced glass or something similar, revealing the star-studded void outside. Here, the swirling cosmic tapestry was partially obscured by the silhouette of Tsellic warships circling the upper atmosphere. Xenon blue lights blinked along their hulls. On the courtyard floor, rows of Tsellic soldiers drilled in near-perfect unison, their motions precise and lethal. A sea of living armor, each soldier's luminous markings faint compared to the Queen's, but still mesmerizing. Cade drew in a breath. This was the enemy's heart, throbbing with unstoppable might. Then he spotted Zyra standing on a raised observation platform, flanked by a handful of advisors. She turned to watch him approach, expression coolly regal. The entire courtyard seemed to hush. Even the drilling soldiers slowed their routine to cast surreptitious glances at the human who dared to move unbound in their midst. Cade lifted his chin. He wasn't about to show fear. Without preamble, Zyra addressed him, her voice carrying through the hush. "Prove to me that you're worth the trouble. Show me how a human fights." She gestured, and the crowd parted, revealing a circle lined with black pillars. Within that circle stood 3 Tsellic warriors, each armed with a different close combat weapon. One twirled a blade that gleamed with a shimmering alien edge. Another wielded a curved staff crackling with energy. The third flexed claws that glowed with a fierce luminescence, as though they were part of his body. Cade arched a brow at the Queen. "You want me to fight them? Barehanded?" The mocking challenge in his tone earned him a slight tilt of her head. "They have been instructed not to kill you," she said, a faint smirk ghosting over her lips. "Unless you make yourself too difficult to contain. Let this be your trial. If you survive, we'll talk." Her confidence was maddening. The crowd pressed closer, forming an arena, anticipating bloodshed. Cade felt the weight of the collar around his neck, the alien suit hugging every muscle. If he wanted a shot at freedom, or even at revenge, he had to play this game. He stepped into the ring, swallowing the dryness in his throat. The 3 warriors immediately moved to encircle him. They were all taller, faster, with that innate Tsellic grace. He inhaled, focusing on the faint hum of the suit. Perhaps it would give him a boost, or maybe it would paralyze him at the worst moment. The tension unspooled in his chest, replaced by the familiar edge of battle readiness. He crouched, ignoring the burning ache in his bruises. The first warrior lunged, staff crackling as it swung in a wide arc. Cade barely dodged, bending backward. The air above him sizzled, and a shower of sparks skittered across the floor. He twisted, hooking his leg around the staff's base, yanking the weapon. For an instant, he felt the suit respond, enhancing his movement. The staff jerked free from the warrior's grasp. A fleeting sense of triumph sparked, but it vanished as the second warrior rushed in, blade slicing at Cade's side. He dropped to one knee, staff still in hand, parrying the blow with a flare of discharging energy. The impact rattled his arms. The third warrior leaped from behind, claws glinting with savage brightness. Cade spun, barely in time. He managed a clumsy block, staff meeting those lethal claws in a shower of luminescent sparks. His arms shook under the force. Pain blossomed in his shoulder, but adrenaline roared in his veins, sharpening his reflexes. With a growl, he surged to his feet, staff whirling. He caught the clawed warrior across the torso, driving him back a few steps. A ripple of approval, soft as a whisper, touched Cade's mind. He realized it was the neural link, perhaps a faint echo of the Queen's reaction. The sensation vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the searing reality of a fight that was far from one. The staff-wielding warrior regained his composure, reclaiming his weapon in a swift move. The blade user circled from Cade's left, searching for an opening. The clawed one paced, luminous slashes of color trailing each movement. Cade was outnumbered, cornered, fighting on pure survival instinct. He decided to go on the offensive. Feinting a strike at the blade user, he spun and lashed out at the warrior with the staff, forcing him to block. As they engaged, the clawed warrior lunged for Cade's back. Cade dropped low, half rolling away, though not fast enough to avoid a glancing cut across his flank. The pain was sharp, hot. He hissed but gritted his teeth, ignoring it. Channeling every ounce of training he had, he feigned a stumble. The staff wielder moved in to capitalize on his supposed weakness, but Cade flipped the staff up in a desperate arc, smacking the Tselik in the jaw. A startled grunt escaped the alien's throat, and Cade followed with a powerful kick. The warrior crashed to the ground. The crowd murmured, a ripple of excitement. Tselik eyes glowed with either outrage or fascination. The blade user wasted no time, darting in. Their weapons clashed, singing with high-pitched hums. For a moment, Cade held his ground, arms quaking. Then the clawed warrior joined from behind, claws slicing toward Cade's neck. The collar thrummed, as if reacting to the threat. Cade wrenched himself sideways, hooking an arm around the blade user's shoulder to pivot away, but the claws raked across his chest armor, leaving a molten trail in the plating. Sparks showered, and he gasped as the alien suit attempted to repair itself mid-fight. He responded with a savage strike of his elbow into the blade user's midsection, then swept the staff in a low arc to knock the clawed warrior off balance. It was a chaotic dance of near misses, savage collisions, and desperate maneuvers. Each time Cade seemed cornered, he found a shred of adrenaline or an opening to exploit, while the Tseliks tested him with merciless intent. At last, he managed to disarm the blade user, slamming the staff into the alien's wrist. The blade clattered to the ground, and Cade drove a knee into the alien's sternum, sending him sprawling. That left only the clawed warrior, who rushed forward with a guttural hiss. They locked weapons, staff against glowing claws, energy crackling at every contact. The crowd erupted in excited murmurs. Cade's limbs trembled from exertion, but he pressed on, fueled by sheer will. In one final maneuver, he twisted the staff down, hooking it under the warrior's arm, and leveraged a harsh throw that flipped the alien onto his back with a bone-jarring thud. The courtyard fell silent. 3 Tselik warriors lay beaten, though not dead. Cade stood in the center, chest heaving, blood trickling from a cut on his brow, the collar's hum intensifying with each rapid heartbeat. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a slow clap echoed from the observation platform. Zyra watched him, her iridescent patterns alive with shifting color. It was unclear whether she was truly impressed or merely playing a part, but her singular applause reverberated in the hush. "Well done," she said softly, just loud enough to carry. "You might actually prove worthy." There was a dangerous gleam in her eyes, and despite the bruises and the burn of the suit, Cade felt a sharp jolt of triumph. He had survived. More than that, he had shown he could stand toe-to-toe with her best. Still, the knowledge that she could kill him with a single command gnawed at the back of his mind. A wave of exhaustion threatened to pull him under, but he straightened, refusing to let her see weakness. She gestured again, signaling the end of the trial. Medics rushed in to tend the fallen warriors. Cade expected the same courtesy, but no one came to his aid. Instead, the Queen's chilling voice addressed him. Come with me. We have much to discuss. The collar tightened fractionally, a silent order. He took a steadying breath and followed a guard up to the observation platform. Every step sent jolts of pain through his battered body, but he forced his feet to move. The moment he reached the top, Zyra turned on her heel and swept out of the courtyard, her gown trailing behind like a living shadow. The guard motioned for Cade to follow. Beneath the battered armor, his pulse pounded. He wondered if he had any leverage at all in this twisted arrangement. Perhaps not. But for now, he was still alive, which was more than he'd expected from this day. Step after step, he proceeded down another corridor, trailing just behind the alien queen. If she noticed his limping gait, she made no comment. They entered a smaller chamber, richly appointed with alien tapestries and softly glowing sculptures that pulsed in rhythm with something that felt like a distant heartbeat. Zyra dismissed the guard with a flick of her wrist. The door slid shut behind them, leaving Cade alone with her in the softly lit space. She inclined her head toward a low seat carved from smooth stone. Sit, she commanded. He weighed the order, then dropped onto the seat with more exhaustion than he cared to admit. She stood before him, luminous markings dancing along the curves of her neck and shoulders. For a moment neither spoke. Tension crackled, the air thick with the charge of unspoken challenge. At last, she broke the silence. You are formidable, she said, eyes narrowing slightly. Stronger than I anticipated for a human. The traitors within my ranks fear such strength could unify others against me. Her tone was calm, but her markings betrayed a swirl of anger, or perhaps hunger for power. I've considered having you killed to make an example. But that would be a waste. He let out a slow breath. So, you need a weapon to use against your enemies. And you think that's me? Are you not hungry for vengeance? She asked, stepping closer. The subtle scent of her skin teased his senses, spicy, electric. Our rebellion has allied with human guerrillas who hate the Tselek as much as you do. If they overthrow me, your entire species would be crushed in the chaos. Align with me, and you stand a chance to end the bloodshed on your terms. A bitter laugh escaped him. You burn my worlds, then offer peace if I fight your rebels? Her lips quirked. This is war. Allies are never simple. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Help me hold my throne, and perhaps your people will see a different side of the Tselek. Or turn me down, and your fate is sealed. He studied her, noticing how the luminescence along her cheekbones shifted, almost pulsing in time with her heartbeat. What do you actually want from me, Zyra? For the first time, her composure wavered, just a fraction. Your loyalty, she answered, voice low. I need someone who isn't afraid of me, who can stand by my side without cowering. Even my highest generals flinch at my command. Power is lonely, human, and it demands a cost. She reached out, brushing her fingertips over the collar. A jolt ran down his spine. I haven't decided if you're worth sparing yet, but there's a fire in you that intrigues me. Defy me, challenge me, yet still fight with me. That might be the key to saving this dominion from internal collapse. His heart pounded. Part of him recognized a bizarre reflection here. She was an empress, unstoppable to most, but on the verge of losing her hold. He was a soldier without an army, driven by vengeance. Their collision felt inevitable, a storm of conflict and attraction. The tension now bordered on unbearable. He was acutely aware of her proximity, the swirling patterns on her skin, the resonant hush of her voice. But he shoved those unwanted sensations aside. She was the enemy. The fact that her nearness made his blood surge only intensified his anger. If I do this, he said, ignoring the dryness in his mouth, if I help you destroy the rebellion, will you spare my people? Will you leave them alone? She studied him for a long moment. I can promise negotiations, she allowed. But I will not kneel to human demands. He clenched his jaw. Not good enough. A fleeting smile tugged at her mouth. Perhaps you misunderstand. You're in no position to negotiate. Your compliance is the only reason you still breathe. Her hand drifted from the collar to his chin, tilting it up just enough to force eye contact. The alien texture of her skin sent a chill across his flesh. You can accept or be forced. The outcome matters more than your comfort. Anger flared. He jerked his chin free from her hold, ignoring the wave of new pain that flared in his wounded side. If that's the case, kill me now. I won't be your puppet. She let her hand drop, a hint of admiration flickering across her features. You cling to your pride. That's why I'm giving you the illusion of choice. She stepped back. I'll allow you a day to decide. If you won't submit willingly, I'll use the neural link to compel you. Either way, you will be a part of my plans. His pulse spiked at the subtle threat laced in her words. The collar seemed to grow heavier, as if responding to her intention. She turned and walked to the door, her gown shifting like liquid night around her body. Rest, she commanded. Tomorrow, I will show you exactly what's at stake. Then she slipped out, leaving him alone with the echoes of her power. The tension in the room dissipated slightly, but the collar's presence remained a stark reminder that he was never truly free. He sat in silence, mind racing. Everything about this felt like being caught in a vortex of conflicting needs: his hunger for revenge, her unstoppable authority, and the swirling attraction he refused to fully acknowledge. Maybe this was an opportunity. If she had an internal rebellion, perhaps he could fan those flames, turning them against her. But if that rebellion was tied to human insurgents who might be no less dangerous, the situation grew more complex. The lines of friend and foe blurred in the darkest corners of alien politics. Sleep took him in sporadic fits, haunted by memories of fire and screams, of the Tselix ships raining destruction on his world. Nightmares twisted with the faint hum of the neural link, as if some foreign presence lurked in the recesses of his thoughts. He woke to find an alien medic scanning his injuries with a handheld device. They said nothing, merely applied some ointment that crackled with energy, healing cuts and bruises at a rapid pace. Then they left, no more talk than a phantom in the night. The next day came without a sunrise. This fortress, suspended in endless space, allowed no natural day or night. Yet there was a shift in the environment, the corridor lights intensifying from pale blue to gold, marking a new cycle. A guard arrived at his door, unlocking it with a silent motion. He stood body stiff but significantly improved from the swift alien healing. The guard gestured for him to follow. They led him through winding halls until they reached what appeared to be a grand war room. Holographic displays dominated the center, flickering with star maps, planetary schematics, and lines of Tselix script. Several high-ranking officials stood around, speaking in hushed tones. Zyra presided at the head of the table, her regal posture unyielding. When she saw him enter, she lifted a hand, silencing the room. I want you to witness something, she said, gesturing toward a shimmering projection. These are the rebel forces. They aim to destabilize my rule by targeting supply lines, communications hubs, and colonies that remain loyal to me. They've allied with smaller human factions on fringe worlds, promising them freedom from Tselix dominion. That includes the group that aided your colony, Cade. He moved closer to the projection, eyes scanning the data. Fleets massed at strategic points, planets flickered in red, signifying areas of conflict or infiltration. What do you want from me? He asked. Information, she said bluntly. If you have contacts among the rebels, you could help me locate their main stronghold. In return, I would consider terms for your people's autonomy. Or, if you prefer, I can take the information directly from your mind through the neural link. She locked eyes with him. But I'd prefer your cooperation. He sensed the silent watchers in the room, Tselix commanders with scanning eyes, their expressions stoic yet brimming with mistrust. One, a tall alien with elongated features, stepped forward. My queen, we cannot trust him. His kind has no loyalty. Cade snorted. Loyalty is earned, not demanded. He caught a flash of curiosity in Zyra's gaze, as though she was tempted to rebuke her own commander to see how Cade would respond. Instead, she remained silent, letting the tension thicken. Finally, she spoke. He will do as I order. If not willingly, then by force. Her gaze flicked to him, daring him to protest. Cade, the collar you wear can do more than monitor your vitals. It can override your nervous system if I so choose. However, I believe the cost in your mental coherence would be detrimental. I'd rather have a partner than a puppet. Her voice dropped lower. But only if you accept the bond. A shiver of revulsion rippled through him at the idea of losing control over his own body. Partner, he repeated sarcastically, letting the taste of the word roll on his tongue. His gaze swept the table, seeing the suspicion in every Tsellic face. Let me guess, you want me to lead a covert strike against these rebels, prove my usefulness? Her markings flared with subtle luminescence. Among other things. You know them, or so I suspect. They've sheltered humans who escaped our dominion. And you have a personal grudge against me that might just translate into a fierce determination to stand at my side. She took a step toward him, her voice growing softer. Let me be clear, if I fall, Tsellic dominion collapses, and the rebels will not spare humans they deem a threat. My leadership is the only thing holding their wrath in check. She was playing a careful game. He recognized the manipulative threads, but also sensed truth in her words. The rebels would likely be no kinder to humans who opposed their brand of revolution. Perhaps it was naive to assume they'd share his values. War had a way of making monsters of everyone. So you're the devil I know, he said quietly, ignoring the uncomfortable knowledge that he was drawn to her presence, to the raw aura of control she wielded. She inclined her head. Precisely. He let out a long breath, weighed the risk. If he refused, she'd eventually tear the knowledge from his mind or kill him outright. If he agreed, he'd be tied to her cause, but maybe that meant a slim chance to spare more human lives. And there was something else, an undeniable current running between them. It felt like the early rumblings of a thunderstorm. He forced down the thought. All right, he said at last. I'll help you. But I want your word my people will not be targeted further. She smiled, slow and lethal, as if both victorious and intrigued. I'll make the necessary arrangements. Now show me what you know. She swept a hand over the projection. Start with their approach to your colony. He cast a quick, uneasy glance at the ring of Tsellic commanders around them, then stepped toward the hologram. Over the next hour, he pointed out known smuggling routes, suspected hideouts, gleaned from rumors he'd overheard on the fringes of human-occupied space. The Tsellic officials listened in stony silence. Every so often, Zyra would interject, clarifying or comparing his insights with their intelligence. With each exchanged glance, he felt a subtle undercurrent pass between them, an uneasy alliance brimming with the potential for betrayal or something far more complicated. When he finished, she dismissed the others with curt nods. They obeyed without question, leaving the two alone in the war room's hush. The floating star maps glowed in silent testimony. Zyra angled her head, studying him with hooded eyes. You've cooperated, she observed, her tone thoughtful. He shrugged, feigning indifference. I'd prefer not to die. And maybe saving a few human colonies is worth something. Her lips curved. Pragmatic. But I sense there's more to you than simple survival. Her gaze lingered on the bruises visible around his collar, the raw scrapes on his hands. You hold on to vengeance, but I suspect it's transforming into something else in my presence. He stiffened. That faint prickling at the base of his skull told him the collar, maybe even her mental presence, was picking up more than he wanted to share. Don't assume you know me. Her laughter was rich, echoing off the stone walls. No, I don't. But I intend to. She moved closer, the space between them charged with a heady mix of suspicion and intrigue. Her luminous skin patterns shifted, shimmering in restless waves. We are bonded by necessity. A forced partnership, yes. But do not pretend you feel nothing here. One slender finger lifted to trace the edge of the collar, making him shudder despite his best efforts. He willed his heart to steady. I feel anger, he said, though the words came out more ragged than intended. I feel the weight of your empire bearing down on my people. And if I could, I'd tear it down brick by brick. Yet here you stand, she whispered, leaning close enough that he caught the faint, electrifying scent that seemed to cling to her skin. Bound by your own choice, if only because the alternative is worse. Their eyes met, a collision of heat and hate. Time suspended, and he was abruptly aware of how fast his pulse pounded, how the environment felt charged as if preparing for a storm. An alien queen, the sworn enemy of his people, was standing so close that he could feel the warmth of her breath. In his mind, the memory of blazing colonies stoked his fury. But in his body, a different tension simmered. Abruptly, she stepped back, severing the taut line of energy. Her expression smoothed into regal composure. Prepare yourself, she said, voice cool again. A mission awaits. We'll target one of the rebel strongholds. You will lead us through their hidden corridors. He swallowed, ignoring the flutter in his stomach. Fine. Let's get it done. She nodded, her luminous pattern settling into a calm glow. Guards will escort you to gear up. Don't try anything foolish. That collar's hold on you can be tightened with a thought. He offered a mirthless grin. Wouldn't dream of it. But as he turned to leave, the knowledge that he was stepping deeper into her world, her orbit, felt like a slow fall into a star's gravity well. Perhaps there was no escape from the pull. They moved swiftly. Within the hour, a strike team assembled, a handful of Tselix soldiers clad in advanced exosuits, along with Cade. He stood at the docking bay, scanning the sleek dropship that would carry them to the rebel outpost. The place pulsed with the hum of power couplings and the hiss of automated loaders. Outside the bay's translucent shield, the black expanse of space loomed, dotted with flickers of starlight. Zyra appeared, flanked by two high-ranking officers. She wore a more practical attire now, though still regal, a fitted bodysuit with layered armor that wrapped around her torso and arms in dark spirals. A short cloak, trimmed in the same alien gold, hung from her shoulders. She motioned for him to follow her onto the dropship. The interior was cramped and Spartan, designed purely for function. Rows of seats lined the walls, harnesses bracing for turbulence. Cade strapped in, ignoring the suspicious glances from the Tselix soldiers. Zyra took her place at the front, near the pilot's console. The doors sealed, and the engines roared to life. No words were exchanged as they tore away from the fortress. The craft trembled, G-forces pressing them back. Then a brief weightlessness as they accelerated into the void. Cade clenched his fists, heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He could sense Zyra's presence even without looking at her. It was as though the neural link wrapped them in a tenuous thread, a vibrating cord of awareness. He stared out the small viewport. Swirls of cosmic dust illuminated by distant stars filled his vision. Somewhere amid that vast darkness lay the rebel stronghold, a place rumored to be hidden within an asteroid belt or the craters of a desolate moon. Soon enough, the pilot's voice crackled through the ship's comms, announcing their approach. Cade unbuckled himself, rolling his shoulders to loosen the knots of tension. The Tselix soldiers checked their weapons, each movement precise and disciplined. Then came the lurch of deceleration, the hiss of landing gear deploying. The ramp whirred open, revealing a bleak, rocky landscape under a canopy of flickering starlight. Sharp spires of rock jutted from the ground, and a thin atmosphere gave everything a cold, metallic taste. Cade stepped onto the surface, flanked by armed Tselix. The Queen emerged last, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. "Show us the entrance," she said, voice cutting through the thin air. He jerked his head. "The outpost is rumored to be beneath those ridges," he said. "We'll have to navigate tight passageways. It's heavily mined." No point withholding details now. If he got them lost, the collar would do the rest. Plus, he intended to see if the rumors about the outpost's defenders were true. If they were as desperate and violent as the Tselix, maybe it was all the same in the end. The team advanced cautiously, scanning for life signs or tripwires. Cade took the lead, shining a handheld light on the rocky walls. Behind him, he felt the laser-focused intensity of Zyra. She was trusting him for this mission, though trust was hardly the right word. More like pressing him into service while holding a knife to his throat. Yet he couldn't deny a strange thrill at having her at his back, an ally, for now, in a place where danger lurked around every corner. They found the entrance, a jagged crack in the rock camouflaged by debris. A Tselek soldier used a scanning device to confirm structural hollows beneath. Then the Queen signaled for everyone to proceed. The corridor that opened up was narrow and dark, swirling dust motes glittering in their lights. Cade led them deeper, conscious of the uneven floor and potential traps. Time stretched. The only sounds were the hush of boots scraping stone and the distant hum of the Tselek suits. Finally, they emerged into a wider cavern, lit by makeshift lamps. Crates and scattered tools indicated recent activity. Zyra tensed, eyes sweeping the shadows. Then came the telltale click of weapons. Figures stepped out from behind crates and rock formations, their silhouettes a ragtag mix of alien and human. The rebels had found them first. A tall woman with cropped hair and an improvised rifle leveled it at Cade. "Traitor!" she spat. "I knew we couldn't trust you." He froze, the insult stinging more than he'd expected. Zyra raised her hand, and her soldiers fanned out, aiming advanced plasma rifles. The tension skyrocketed, pulses of adrenaline banging in Cade's veins. "You're cornered," Zyra said coolly, stepping forward. "Surrender peacefully, and I may spare some of you." The rebel woman sneered. "We'd rather die free than live under Tselek tyranny." She glanced at Cade with open disgust. "You were supposed to help us. Yet here you stand with her." Cade realized too late that these must be the same underground network that once aided his colony. The irony twisted his gut. He tried to speak, but the collar tightened, and Zyra's gaze flashed a warning. His words died in his throat. Shots erupted. The rebels fired on the Tselek, and the Tselek returned fire with lethal precision. The cavern filled with blasts of light, and the acrid smell of burning rock. Cade ducked behind a boulder, cursing under his breath. He'd walked them into a bloodbath. But in war, there were no illusions of a clean outcome. The Queen advanced like a living storm, her personal shield shimmering as rebel bullets and plasma bursts deflected away. She moved with deadly grace, firing pulses from a wrist-mounted weapon that dropped one rebel after another. Adrenaline tore through Cade. He couldn't stand idly by. If he tried to switch sides now, the collar would incapacitate or kill him. That left only one choice. He engaged, trying to subdue rather than kill, but it was nearly impossible in the chaos. A rebel lunged at him with a jagged blade. He disarmed the attacker with a brutal twist, but another took a shot that grazed his armor. He spun, delivering a knockout blow, heart pounding with sickening conflict. His colony had relied on these rebels once, and now he was forced to strike them down. When the dust settled, the cavern reeked of smoke and blood. Bodies lay scattered, some groaning in pain, others motionless. Zyra's forces took positions, searching for survivors. The tall woman who had called Cade a traitor lay slumped against a crate, clutching a wound in her side. Cade hurried over, ignoring the collar's warning tingle, and knelt beside her. "I didn't want this," he began, but she spat weakly, glowering at him. "Death is better than Tselek chains," she rasped. Then her eyes flickered shut. He pressed a hand to the wound, feeling warm blood seep through his fingers. Her breathing went shallow, and within seconds, it stopped entirely. A cold hollowness consumed him. He barely noticed Zyra approaching, her footsteps echoing in the cavern's hush. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and the neural link vibrated with her presence. It was an alien comfort, if it could be called comfort at all. "You did well," she said, voice carefully neutral. "We'll search for intelligence among their files." He rose, fist clenched. "I didn't do anything well," he muttered, bitterness lancing his words. A part of him wanted to rip the collar off and tear into her, consequences be damned. But the faces of the rebels, humans and alien defectors alike, were now just casualties of war. And he was knee-deep in Tselek bloodshed. Zyra beckoned him to follow. They picked their way through the carnage, stepping over strewn crates and scorched rock. A side tunnel led to a command hub, glowing screens arrayed against the rough walls. The Tsellik soldiers had already begun sifting through data, copying anything of value. Cade scanned the displays, searching for clues about his old contacts. His gaze fell on a file listing coordinates for multiple safe houses. The next wave of rebel attacks was already planned. Zyra tapped a control panel, reading the Tsellik script with practiced ease. Her luminous patterns flared in satisfaction. "They have a meeting scheduled with other factions," she murmured. "If we intercept them, the entire rebellion could collapse." She looked at Cade, studying the tension in his posture. "This is what must be done to stop further bloodshed. You see that now, don't you?" He bit back an angry retort. She was trying to justify this massacre, to rope him deeper into her logic of conquest. "I see that there's no easy way out," he managed, voice thick with subdued rage. She sighed, a rare hint of weariness creeping into her tone. "If you must blame me, so be it. But they would have shown you no mercy either. War is cruelty, no matter who wages it." A flicker of empathy, if it was truly empathy, flashed in her eyes. For a moment, her aloof mask cracked, revealing a figure who bore the weight of an empire's darkness. Then it was gone, replaced by the unyielding queen once more. "Secure this site," she commanded the soldiers. "Return to the fortress with everything you can salvage." Cade retreated from her side, letting the Tsellik do their work. His mind roiled with conflicting thoughts, guilt heavy in his gut. He found himself wandering the edges of the cavern, stepping over rubble and weaving through columns of jagged rock. The battle replayed in his mind, each rebel face seared into his memory. He felt a presence behind him, a guard perhaps, until a soft voice spoke. "Torn, are we?" He spun, seeing Zyra. Somehow, she'd managed to slip away from her subordinates to find him. He huffed. "What do you want?" Her gaze flickered across the carnage. "I want to ensure you understand the stakes. You asked me to spare your people, but you see how these rebels operate. They'd turn your kind into expendable pawns or casualties if it served their cause." She gestured to a row of fallen rebels. "They fought hard, but they couldn't see beyond their hatred of me." He shook his head in frustration. "And my hatred of you? Does that not matter to you at all?" She pressed her lips together, luminous patterns shifting. "It matters. But perhaps I can change it." A surprising statement, delivered in a quiet tone. Then, as if realizing she'd shown too much softness, she raised her chin. "You're bound to me by circumstances. In time, you might see I'm not your greatest enemy." He narrowed his eyes, unsettled by her words. "I doubt that." A faint smile ghosted her lips. "Then prove me wrong. Fight alongside me, and see if your perspective shifts." The collar tingled, as though echoing her unspoken challenge. He despised the sense of being tethered to her, yet there was something undeniably compelling about the prospect of seeing more, learning more. Perhaps, in that process, he might find a weakness in her empire's defenses. Soldiers approached, indicating they were ready to depart. The final bodies were bagged, the equipment packed. They made their way back to the dropship, the stench of gunpowder and scorched flesh clinging to their clothes. Cade boarded in silence, mind churning. Zyra sat across from him in the cramped seating. He refused to look her way, though he felt her stare boring into him. The ship's engines roared, lifting them off the rock. Through the viewport, he watched the rebel outpost shrink into a speck of ruin. He wondered how many had escaped, how many would spread tales of this atrocity, painting him as a turncoat. Anger flared anew, directed at himself, at Zyra, at the galaxy for forging such a twisted path. Yet beneath that anger, a budding awareness gnawed at him, a recognition that their bond, forced as it was, seemed to be tightening with each shared conflict. He silently vowed to remain vigilant, to remember who she was and what she had done. There would be no illusions of trust. They returned to the fortress, and the cycle repeated, debriefings, silent medics tending wounds, uneasy nights. Yet as days passed, the friction between them evolved into a dangerous dance. Each time she summoned him to discuss strategy or infiltration, he felt the old rage mingle with an odd, sharp attraction. She tested him constantly, pushing him to adapt to Tsellik technology, to endure training sessions with her elite warriors. In turn, he refused to submit fully, meeting her challenges with raw defiance. She'd punish him by tightening the collar, but never to the point of crippling him. It was a controlled burn, fueling a growing tension that was as much about battle as it was about desire. Neither acknowledged it outright, but the undercurrent was there, simmering beneath each heated argument. The fortress's upper spires were a labyrinth of corridors and private chambers. One evening, after a particularly grueling training bout, he found himself summoned to her personal quarters. The guard at the door refused to enter, leaving Cade to step inside alone. The room was dimly lit by shifting orbs of light that hovered near the ceiling, casting ghostly patterns on the walls. An open window, or perhaps a force field, looked out over the star-streaked void. Exotic plants with luminescent leaves lined the perimeter, their glow reflecting off polished floors. Zyra stood near a curved balcony, arms folded, body taut with some inner tension. She cast him a sidelong glance, eyes flickering over his form. "Your suit fits you better now," she observed. "You move with more confidence." He gave a short nod. "I adapt quickly." His voice echoed in the wide chamber. He didn't dare step too close. The collar made sure to remind him of its presence every time he even thought of crossing boundaries. She turned, facing him fully. Her attire was more relaxed, though still regal, flowing fabric draped over one shoulder, exposing the iridescent lines that curved down the other. He knew enough about Select biology now to guess that her patterns would shift color depending on her mood. They glowed in soft, pulsing shades of midnight blue and violet, swirling along her collarbone like living tattoos. "Come," she said, gesturing to the balcony. He hesitated, then moved within arm's reach, peering out at the star's cape. The fortress orbited a planet covered in swirling storm clouds, lit by occasional flashes of lightning. "You wanted to see me?" he asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. She studied his profile, a faint tilt to her head. "I wanted to speak without the eyes of the court or the ears of my commanders." A pause lingered, weighted with the tension that always danced between them. "It's been weeks since you joined our efforts. We've crushed several rebel outposts. Yet the revolt continues. My advisors believe we should destroy every planet harboring traitors. I am inclined to consider their advice." He clenched his jaw. "And I suppose you're asking for my input?" The hypocrisy stung. After everything, she still toyed with genocide as a solution. She inhaled, focusing on the swirling planet below. "I'm asking if you think it's worth sparing them." She flicked her gaze to meet his. "If we can break their leadership, perhaps peace can be achieved without annihilation. But that will require precision strikes, infiltration. And you, Cade." Her voice dropped, taking on that resonant undercurrent. "To get close enough to do real damage, we need someone the rebels might still trust." He barked a humorless laugh. "Trust me? They think I'm your pet soldier now." Her lips tightened. "Some might still remember that you fought against my forces. Perhaps they'd let you in for negotiations or covert sabotage. It's our best shot at ending this war without committing a widespread massacre." She leaned forward, the fabric shifting to reveal more of her shimmering skin. "Think about it. You could save thousands of lives, human and Select alike." The collar pulsed, as if echoing the intensity of her words. He found himself caught between resentment and an odd sense of responsibility. If infiltration could truly prevent a greater catastrophe, did he have any choice? "If I do this," he said softly, voice tight, "you have to promise me something. If the infiltration works, if we dismantle the rebellion from the inside, you don't move against my colony or the others trying to live in peace." She eyed him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she inclined her head. "Agreed. But betray me, and I'll finish what my armies started on your homeworld." His stomach twisted. Yet amid the swirling dread, a flicker of determination took root. "I'll do it. But we do it my way, covertly. No Select ground troops until we've isolated the rebel command." She gave him a slight nod, stepping closer. Her voice lowered. "I'd expect nothing less from you." Standing so near, He could see the minuscule patterns of her luminescence shift like swirling galaxies. The curve of her lips was neither strictly cruel nor kind. It was charged with the intangible friction that had grown between them. "You're stronger than any human I've encountered." He stayed silent, noticing how her presence, though menacing, was also enthralling. Something inside him stirred, a visceral awareness of her alien allure. He reminded himself she was the enemy, the very one who'd commanded the destruction of his people. But that logic faltered under the potent aura radiating from her. She reached out, brushing a fingertip across his collarbone where the armor parted. The contact sent a crackle of sensation through him, the neural link amplifying the touch until it thrummed in his skull. "You're still defiant," she murmured, eyes half-lidded. "Yet you stand here, forging plans with me." His breath hitched. "I stand here because the alternative is worse." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Yes, keep telling yourself that." She let her hand linger for an excruciating moment longer, then withdrew. "We depart in 2 days. You'll have your infiltration plan ready by then, or the deal is off." He nodded once, stepping back. The collar's hum subsided, letting him breathe again. "Fine," he said curtly, half turning to leave. But before he could go, she added quietly, "Cade." He paused, glancing over his shoulder. Her luminous gaze locked on his, a fleeting moment of vulnerability flickering there. "Don't make me regret sparing you," he scoffed, but his voice came out softer than expected. "Same goes for you, Zyra." And with that, he walked out, pulse roaring in his ears. The next 2 days were a blur of clandestine preparations. He assembled a small group, Select soldiers who could mimic rebel code phrases, plus a translator device to help him slip into rebel networks more easily. The collar's presence weighed on him constantly, reminding him of how precarious his situation was. He caught glimpses of Zyra stalking the corridors or conferring with her officers, never once betraying a flicker of doubt about the upcoming operation. If she had any personal misgivings, she kept them well hidden. The day of departure arrived. The infiltration team boarded a smaller, stealth-equipped craft, leaving the fortress behind. Zyra would remain at a nearby vantage point with reinforcements, ready to strike if Cade and his group succeeded in disabling the rebel command center's defenses. As the craft hurtled through the emptiness of space, Cade mulled over the question that gnawed at him. If he managed to sabotage the rebels, was he dooming any chance of toppling Select oppression? But if these rebels were the same ones he fought days ago, fueled by unrestrained violence, perhaps they offered no real salvation either. They landed on an uncharted moon, pockmarked by craters. A labyrinth of canyons provided cover for rebel hideouts. The infiltration went surprisingly smooth at first. Cade's presence, and the half-truths he spun about being forced to serve the Queen under threat, convinced some of the outpost guards to let him pass. Over hours of tense negotiation, he managed to speak with a mid-level rebel leader, feigning an attempt at defection. The guards eyed the Select soldiers warily, but the advanced stealth tech disguised them as mercenaries hired by Cade. Every step felt like treading a razor's edge, the collar threatening to betray him if he deviated from the plan. Eventually, he gleaned the location of the rebellion's main communication hub, hidden in a subterranean bunker. Perfect for sabotage. Under the guise of forging an alliance, Cade and the disguised Select were escorted into the bunker's lower levels. Unbeknownst to the rebels, Zyra and her fleet hovered in the moon's orbit, waiting for Cade's signal. His heart pounded as he placed small, high-tech charges at key structural points. The tension with each concealed device mirrored the swirl of emotion inside him. Once these detonators went off, the entire nerve center of the rebellion would be crippled. The Queen would descend in full force, and the rebels would be annihilated. "Are you sure about this?" muttered one of the Select in his ear, voice disguised by a translator. Cade hesitated a fraction before nodding. What choice did he have? The collar's small pulses reminded him that Zyra was monitoring. She might even be listening in on everything he heard and said. He set the final charge, then led his group back through the bunker's corridors, feigning a casual inspection of the facility. An alarm blared suddenly, and the corridor lights turned red. Over the intercom, a voice shouted, "We've been betrayed!" All units, lock down the exits! Cade's blood ran cold. Someone had figured them out. Maybe they had recognized that Selleck accent in his so-called mercenaries. Or maybe an energy scan had detected the hidden charges. Shouts and gunfire erupted in the halls. Rebels sprang from doorways, rifles blazing. The infiltration team returned fire with lethal force, pinned down by a barrage of bullets and plasma. Cade cursed under his breath. If the infiltration was compromised, they had to blow the charges now or risk being overrun. He ducked behind a metal bulkhead and keyed in the detonation command on his wrist device. He slammed the transmit button. Deafening explosions rippled through the bunker, shaking the entire complex. Lights flickered, and the floor buckled beneath his feet. A wave of heat and debris thundered down the corridor. The screams of wounded rebels pierced the air. The Selleck infiltration team regrouped around Cade, returning fire as they pushed toward an exit. Choking smoke filled the corridors, and the stench of burning metal stung his nostrils. "Move!" he shouted, pointing toward a half-collapsed passage that led to the surface. They fought their way through pockets of rebel resistance. He felt torn as he took down fighters who, just hours ago, had believed he might be their ally. But the collar's subtle throbs urged him on, reminding him that hesitation would cost his life. They burst out onto the cratered surface, the moon's thin atmosphere whipping dust into swirling clouds. Zyra's ships roared overhead. In a matter of minutes, Selleck dropships landed in force, unleashing squads of heavily armed troops. The rebels, disorganized by the internal explosions, scrambled to defend their base. Another brutal firefight broke out. Plasma bolts crisscrossed the dusty terrain, and the ground shuddered under the impact of artillery. Cade's infiltration team provided coordinates, guiding the Selleck troops to critical points. Within a short span, the bunkers were overrun. Smoke billowed from crater after crater, each one littered with rebel casualties. Amid the chaos, Cade spotted a group of rebels attempting to flee in a small transport. Without thinking, he sprinted across open ground, ignoring the blasts scorching the air. He reached the vehicle just as it powered up its thrusters. A rebel aimed a pistol at him. Cade knocked it aside with a swift strike, yanking the rebel from the cockpit. He jumped in, shutting down the engines. Furious, terrified faces glared at him. He stared back, chest heaving, mind spinning. His wrist palm crackled to life. Zyra's voice, cool and commanding. "We have them cornered. Eliminate any remaining pockets of resistance." He froze. A wave of revulsion washed over him. He looked at the wide-eyed rebels, who were mostly younger than him, some trembling with the raw fear of near defeat. "They're unarmed now." He spat into the calm. "We've destroyed their base. Let them go." A beat of silence. Then a static-laden reply. "That's not your decision, Cade. Execute them or stand aside." He felt the collar tighten, a sharp squeeze on his windpipe. Sweat beaded at his temple. This was the moment. He could slaughter these survivors or defy the Queen. Torn, he clenched his fists. The rebels cowered, some raising hands in surrender. "I can't," he hissed into the calm. Her voice turned cold. "Stand aside, then. My troops will handle it." A wave of dread flooded him. The collar loosened, allowing him to breathe, but left him feeling sick to his core. That Selleck would show no mercy. He had to make a choice, obey or resist. In the back of his mind, something snapped. He growled and stepped out of the transport. Hands raised. A squad of Selleck soldiers approached, weapons trained on the rebels. Cade stood in their path, blocking their line of fire. "Move!" the lead soldier snarled, luminous eyes burning with aggression. Cade squared his shoulders, every nerve on edge. "No," he said, voice cracking with the weight of potential rebellion. "They've surrendered. We don't kill prisoners." The soldier's weapon hummed, charging with lethal energy. "Your collar compels obedience to the Queen. Do not stand in our way." Cade braced himself for the crippling shock. But it never came. Instead, a new voice rang out above the commotion, resolute and edged with lethal authority. "Lower your weapons. Heads turned as Zyra herself strode across the battlefield, stepping over debris and bodies. Her armor was scorched in places, her markings pulsing with fierce intensity. She glared at the soldier. "I said, lower your weapons." The Tsellic soldier hesitated, confusion twisting his features. Slowly, he complied, motioning for his squad to do the same. Zyra stared at Cade, her expression unreadable, then at the terrified rebels inside the transport. Her jaw tightened. "If they are unarmed and surrendering, we will take them captive. There will be no needless slaughter." Her soldiers obeyed without question, detaining the rebels rather than executing them. Cade felt his heart hammering. She had contradicted her own orders, perhaps to keep him from outright rebelling. Or maybe because she saw some twisted logic in sparing them as bargaining chips. Either way, she had just saved those rebels. He tried to swallow the relief that threatened to show on his face. He caught her eye, and she gave a minuscule, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging his stand. A grim calm settled over the battlefield as the last pockets of resistance fell silent. The Tsellic had won decisively. The captured rebels huddled together, fear etched into their faces. Though Cade felt little triumph. He'd played a role in crushing them, and the stain of that weighed heavily on his conscience. The collar still encircled his neck, a reminder that he was far from free. They all returned to Zyra's flagship, a monstrous cruiser hovering in orbit above the moon. Detainees were processed in the lower decks, while Cade was summoned to a private chamber near the command center. He arrived to find Zyra waiting, arms folded, her luminous pattern still bright from the adrenaline of battle. The doors sealed behind him with a hiss. They stood there, silent, tension crackling in the air like a storm about to break. "You defied me," she said, voice quiet but simmering with intensity. "You placed yourself between my soldiers and the rebels. That is not how my dominion operates." Her gaze flickered, betraying conflicting emotions. "Yet I overrode your punishment. I spared you the collar's wrath." His fists clenched. "Why?" She exhaled, stepping closer. Her eyes locked onto his, luminous and fierce. "Because you were right. They had surrendered. Slaughtering them would only breed more rebellion. Perhaps it's time I consider an alternative approach. You forced my hand." Her anger and grudging respect collided in each syllable. "I will not let you make a fool of me again." He squared his shoulders, refusing to yield. "You can't keep winning by fear alone." Her lips thinned. "Fear is all some enemies understand. But you make me question that." She lifted a hand, hovering near the collar. "You're the first human, the first being, who has disobeyed me so blatantly yet remained alive. Why do I allow it?" She sounded genuinely perplexed, as though grappling with an internal contradiction. He swallowed hard, the tension palpable. "Maybe you see something in me," he said, voice low. "A reflection you hate to admit." The words spilled out, surprising even himself. She froze, luminous swirls along her throat intensifying. For a split second, he wondered if she'd strike him down. Instead, her hand closed lightly around the collar, her palm resting against the side of his neck. He could feel the heat of her body, the faint tremor in her fingers. A swirl of conflicting desire and rage spun between them, nearly suffocating in its potency. "You are insufferable," she whispered, nails biting into the collar's edge. "Defiant, reckless, and you make me remember I am more than a throne." Her eyes bore into his, the air thick with unspoken promises. "This game is dangerous for both of us." He inhaled unsteadily. "I'm not playing a game. I hate what you've done. I can't forget how your empire slaughtered innocents. But I can't walk away." His voice wavered, torn between condemnation and a strange, undeniable pull. She pressed closer, her armor clinking softly against his. The neural link thrummed. He felt her breath on his face, sending a tremor through him despite his attempts at self-control. "Then don't walk away," she breathed, luminous markings flaring in shades of electric violet. Their proximity was an inferno. The tension that had built over countless arguments and near-death experiences finally reached a breaking point. He was painfully aware of every inch that separated them, of how her gaze seemed to drill into his very core. Weeks of pent-up conflict and reluctant cooperation boiled over. His hands snapped up, grabbing her shoulders. She didn't resist. If anything, she leaned into his touch, eyes wild. He could feel the alien texture of her skin, smooth yet faintly scaled, radiating heat that spiked his pulse. "I should kill you," he growled, voice thick with a savage blend of fury and longing. "You and everything you stand for." Her lips curved in a dangerous smile. "Then do it," she taunted, arching her neck in mock surrender. "But I think we both know you won't." A challenge, a dare. They stood on the edge of a precipice, hearts hammering in unison. He closed his eyes, wrestling with the maelstrom inside. Then his lips crashed onto hers, a brutal, desperate kiss that felt more like a battle than an embrace. She answered with equal ferocity, gripping the back of his head and pulling him closer. The neural link surged, flooding his senses with raw emotion, her rage, her fear, her hunger, her fascination. Their teeth clashed, breath mingling in ragged bursts, each refusing to yield. It was a clash of two unstoppable forces, and yet an inevitability either could deny. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, he tasted blood on his lip. He wasn't sure whose. The collar buzzed around his neck, overstimulated by the spike in adrenaline. She stared at him, eyes ablaze, her luminous patterns bright enough to cast shifting shadows on the walls. "I will not be tamed," she warned, a ragged edge to her voice. He spat a bit of blood to the side. "Good," he rasped. "Because I'm not here to tame you." The undercurrent of violence still lurked, but so did a magnetic pull that was impossible to ignore. He ran a hand over her armor plating, feeling the ridges and the trembling tension beneath. She gripped his wrist, twisting it just enough to assert her dominance, but not enough to hurt him severely. The flicker of pain only sharpened the moment. He pinned her back against the chamber's wall, the collision echoing. Her nails raked across his shoulders, leaving blazing trails. She bit back a sound between a growl and a moan, her body arching against him. He felt the crush of her power, the living force of a queen who held galaxies in her grasp. Yet here they were, locked in a moment that transcended reason. The hatred that fueled them only stoked the flames of a desire they could no longer suppress. She shoved him away suddenly, breathing hard. He stumbled back, heart pounding like a war drum. Her gaze flicked to the door, then returned to him. "Not here," she managed, voice shaky with adrenaline. "Too many eyes, too many ears. I won't let them see me undone." He wiped the blood from his lip. "What, you care about their opinion now?" Her markings flared again, a snarl curling her lips. "Go," she hissed, pointing toward the exit. "If you stay, I might tear you apart." But the heat in her eyes told a different story, a silent promise that this battle was far from over. He lingered, chest heaving, debating whether to defy her once more. A primal part of him wanted to pin her down until either of them could stand. But he forced himself to leave. If they continued in that moment, there was no telling how far they'd go, or what lines they'd cross. He stormed into the corridor, ignoring the startled looks of passing Select officers. The collar still buzzed, reacting to the flood of conflicting signals from both his body and mind. His thoughts spun wildly, tangling anger, desire, guilt, and confusion into a single knot that made it hard to breathe. He wanted to despise her. He wanted to claim her. Above all, he wanted to break the cycle of death and destruction that had shaped both their lives. But how? For the next few days, he avoided her as much as possible, throwing himself into strategic planning with Select commanders, calibrating equipment, ensuring the newly captured rebels were treated minimally well. He snuck in visits to the detention level, making sure they at least received medical attention. The Select guards watched him warily, but since the Queen herself had intervened on the battlefield, they didn't challenge him. It became clear that his role in the Dominion was shifting. He was no mere prisoner now. He was something else, something the Queen refused to define in public. Yet fate refused to grant him peace. A new crisis loomed when intelligence reports indicated the rebel leadership had regrouped on a distant fortress world, uniting under a ruthless warlord. Zyra called an emergency council meeting, commanding Cade to attend. He arrived to find the strategic chamber abuzz with tension. Zyra stood at the center, arms folded, luminous patterns subdued but present. When her eyes met his, a flicker of heat shot through the link, but both kept their composure. A Tsellic officer briefed them on the warlord's movements. Massive fleets were gathering, potentially threatening the entire Dominion. The sense of urgency gripped everyone in the room. Zyra listened, then turned to Cade. "We need a final strike, a decisive blow. If this warlord isn't stopped, the entire empire could collapse. And that means chaos for every colony under Tsellic control, including yours." Her tone was brisk, regal, but she didn't hide the lingering tension between them. Cade nodded slowly. "What do you propose?" She took a breath. "A two-pronged assault. I lead the main fleet against the warlord's armada, drawing them out. You lead a small, elite team to infiltrate the fortress and sabotage its planetary shield. Once the shield is down, our forces can land and neutralize the warlord." She paused, scanning his face. "It's dangerous. If you fail, you'll be stranded with no backup." He let the gravity of the plan sink in. It sounded like a suicide mission, yet also the key to ending the rebellion. If they succeeded, countless lives might be spared from further prolonged conflict. The entire Dominion hinged on this. He glanced at Zyra, noticing the faint tension around her mouth. "All right," he said. "I'll do it." The plan was set. Within hours, the Tsellic fleet mobilized, shimmering starships peeling away from the fortress in coordinated formations. Cade and his infiltration squad boarded a stealth vessel. The sense of finality weighed heavily in the air. As they prepped for departure, Zyra approached him in the hangar, stepping out of her retinue's earshot. "Don't die," she said simply, voice low. "If you do, I'll never forgive you for leaving this unresolved." He almost laughed at the absurdity. "We'll settle this if we both survive," he said, meeting her gaze. A wave of something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the tension that had become as vital as breath. She turned away with a curt nod, returning to her flagship. Cade inhaled sharply and climbed into the stealth craft. The infiltration team included a half-dozen Tsellic commandos, each stoic and deadly. None of them spoke to him unless necessary. He felt their suspicion, their doubt that a human could be trusted with such a critical mission. But the Queen's orders were absolute. They set out for the fortress world, using a circuitous route to avoid the warlord's patrols. Meanwhile, Zyra's main fleet engaged the enemy armada on the far side of the system, drawing their attention. Cade's craft slipped through planetary defenses under cloak, landing in a desolate canyon beyond the fortress walls. The place was a monolithic structure carved into a mountain, bristling with gun turrets and energy barriers. The sky churned with fighter ships, though most had gone to meet Zyra's fleet. Under cover of night, they crept toward the fortress. The plan was straightforward but lethal: breach the outer gates, disable the generator controlling the planetary shield, signal Zyra's forces. The Tsellic commandos moved like shadows, taking out sentries with silent precision. Cade followed, double-checking every corner, every vantage point. At times they had to hide from patrols, pressed close in the darkness. Each moment was a reminder of how fragile this alliance was. If he faltered, if the Tsellic suspected betrayal, the Collar would kill him instantly. They breached the fortress gates in a burst of gunfire and plasma blades, leaving stunned guards in their wake. Alarms blared, lights flickered red, and the infiltration team rushed deeper into the labyrinthine halls. They split into pairs, each heading to a different segment of the shield generator complex. Cade was paired with a commando who spoke little, but moved with lethal efficiency. Gunfights erupted around every turn. The warlord's troops were well-armed and fanatically loyal, fighting with the desperation of cornered beasts. Cade took a glancing hit on his thigh, ignoring the searing pain. Adrenaline and fury kept him going, fueled by the knowledge that success here could end the war. The Collar pulsed, monitoring his stress levels. He gritted his teeth, pressing forward. Finally, they reached the generator chamber, a massive, vaulted room humming with the colossal machinery that projected the planetary shield. Overhead cables crackled with energy. Dozens of enemy soldiers guarded the machinery. Cade cursed under his breath, realizing they were outnumbered. But this was the objective. No retreat, no surrender. Draw their fire, he told the commando. I'll plant the charges. The commando nodded wordlessly. As soon as they stepped into the chamber, the firefight erupted. Plasma bolts screamed past, ricocheting off metal pillars. Cade ducked behind a console, rummaging for the explosives in his pack. He set the timers, hard pounding. If they could just blow the main generator components, it would bring down the shield. But the defenders poured relentless fire on their position, pinning them down. Cade dared a glance and saw the commando pinned behind a column, clutching a wound in his side. Grim determination flared in Cade's chest. He popped up, returning fire to buy a few seconds, then sprinted across open ground, lungs burning. He nearly collided with a row of power couplings that crackled ominously. Shots rang out, scorching the air near his shoulder. At the last moment, he dove behind another console, shoving the charges onto the generator's main conduit. He slapped the arming switch. 30 seconds until detonation. He shouted into his comm. Charges set! Move! The Tselek commando groaned in acknowledgement, staggering to his feet. Together, they unleashed a final barrage of covering fire, forcing the enemy into temporary cover. Then they bolted for the corridor they'd come from, weaving between pillars and wincing at every near miss. 20 seconds left. They broke into the hallway, footsteps pounding. Behind them, shouts of alarm echoed among the generator's whine. 5 seconds. They dove behind a reinforced blast door, bracing. The explosion that followed was deafening, shaking the fortress to its foundations. A wave of heat and pressure roiled through the corridors. The lights flickered, then died, replaced by emergency red lighting. Cade coughed, ears ringing, adrenaline surging. The planetary shield was down. Now it was up to Zyra's fleet. Static crackled in Cade's earpiece. The comm came alive with Tselek voices. Shield down. Commencing landing. Reinforcements inbound. He exhaled shakily, half laughing at the rush of relief. We did it, he said, slumping against the wall. The commando nodded, face impassive but eyes shining with grim satisfaction. Their moment of respite was short-lived. More enemy soldiers swarmed the corridors, furious that their precious shield was gone. Another brutal firefight ensued, pushing Cade and the commando deeper into the fortress. The labyrinth threatened to become their grave. Each passage seemed to funnel them into heavier resistance. He realized with growing alarm that the warlord's forces were converging, trying to trap them. Soon they ended up in a wide corridor with no clear exit, pinned by suppressive fire. The commando sustained another wound, dropping to a knee. Cade pressed a hand to the commando's shoulder, cursing. They were outnumbered 10-1, with nowhere to run. The Tselek soldier gave him a resigned look, as if to say, Go on without me. But Cade couldn't. He refused to abandon his comrade, no matter how uneasy their alliance was. He scanned the corridor, searching for a ventilation shaft, a hidden passage, anything. Then a sudden roar shook the fortress. The wall at the far end of the corridor blasted inward, stone and debris flying. Through the cloud of dust strode Zyra, flanked by a phalanx of Tselek elites. Their arrival was like a hammer striking an anvil. The warlord's troops pivoted to face this new threat, but Zyra's forces tore through them with ruthless efficiency. She stood at the forefront, energy crackling around her gauntlets, luminous patterns blazing. The corridor lit up with strobing blasts of advanced weaponry, a terrifying spectacle of Tselek power. Cade took the opportunity to drag the wounded commando into cover. Then, fueled by a grim sense of purpose, he joined the fray, picking off soldiers. In minutes, the corridor was cleared. Zyra stepped over the fallen, her armor scuffed, her breathing labored, but her presence as imposing as ever. She locked eyes with Cade. Despite the pandemonium, a moment of understanding passed between them, both alive, both battered, yet unbroken. We have the upper hand, she said over the din of weapon fire. The fortress is ours. The warlord is cornered. She nodded to her advisors. Secure the perimeter. End this rebellion. Her elites moved out with well-practiced discipline, leaving Cade and Zyra momentarily alone amid the dust and debris. She surveyed him, noticing the burns on his armor, the fresh blood staining his sleeve. You look half dead, she said softly, luminous patterns dimming with concern. He managed a weary smirk, leaning against a broken column. Still standing, though. Thanks for the rescue. She inclined her head. I had to ensure my infiltration team was successful. He huffed a laugh. Right. Wouldn't want me dying before you can gloat. But the banter held a current of relief. They both knew how close that had been. She stepped nearer, ignoring the fact that any soldier could stumble upon them at any moment. He straightened, heart thudding as the collar buzzed. She reached out, touching his armor in a silent question, checking his injuries. Let's finish this, he said, forcing his tired limbs to move. The warlord? In the central command tower. We have ground troops converging. He won't last long, but he might be dangerous in desperation. Cade nodded, pushing off the column. Together, they navigated the blasted corridors, stepping over rubble and bodies. Along the way, Select soldiers saluted or bowed to Zyra, a demonstration of absolute respect. Cade found it strange how quickly he'd become part of this unstoppable wave. It was a final push through the fortress, clearing pockets of resistance. The sound of sporadic gunfire echoed through the halls. Eventually, they reached the command tower entrance, massive doors sealed shut. Zyra signaled to her soldiers. They placed breaching charges. Cade stood beside her, hand on his weapon. The moment the doors blew, they rushed in. The warlord's last loyalists fired from behind hastily erected barricades. A savage skirmish ensued, but the Tselek elites moved with perfect coordination. One by one, the defenders fell. Cade spotted the warlord, a hulking figure in spiked armor, brandishing a massive energy weapon. With a roar, the warlord lunged at Zyra. She dodged gracefully, unleashing a crackling bolt from her gauntlet that staggered him. Cade joined in, firing at the warlord's flank. The warlord snarled, swinging the weapon in a wide arc that nearly took Cade's head off. Zyra countered with a precise blast, forcing the warlord to his knees. The battered tyrant spat a curse in an alien tongue, helmet cracking to reveal a twisted face etched with rage. With one final burst of energy, Zyra struck him down, the warlord collapsing in a heavy heap. Silence settled. The fortress command tower was secured. Outside the windows, Cade could see the Tselek fleet dominating the skies, no sign of the rebel armada. It was over, the rebellion's final pillar had crumbled. He dropped to a knee, panting, the last reserves of energy draining from his body. Zyra stood over the warlord's corpse, luminous patterns flickering, then dimming. Slowly, she turned to Cade, eyes reflecting the swirling lights of the control panels. It is done, she said, voice subdued. My dominion stands. The war is finished. He forced himself to stand, ignoring the pain that lanced through him. What happens now? She surveyed the carnage, a mix of triumph and weariness etched on her features. Now we rebuild. We stabilize worlds ravaged by conflict. And we honor our agreement. She met his gaze, a solemn pledge in her expression. Your people will not be targeted. They will live under their own governance, so long as they pose no threat to the Dominion. It was the barest concession, but one that might save countless lives. He nodded, relief flickering across his face. Her focus dropped to the collar around his neck. Without warning, she reached for a device on her gauntlet. A beep, and the collar clicked, unlocking. It fell away, clattering to the floor. Cade's breath caught, a rush of sensation as the constant hum he'd learned to ignore disappeared. His neck felt lighter. He stared at her, stunned. You earned your freedom, she said quietly. You're no longer my prisoner. If you choose to leave, you may. But I hope you won't. A rare vulnerability shone in her eyes. He touched his throat, unsure how to respond. The war was over, the rebels defeated, his people spared. Now he was faced with a new question. Did he remain to shape this empire's future, or did he turn his back on everything? As the chaos of the battlefield receded, the tension that bound them did not. She closed the distance between them, her voice scarcely above a whisper. Stay with me. If you go, I won't stop you. But I want you by my side. The final admission, raw and unguarded. They stood in the center of a shattered command tower, the symbol of her triumph, but also the place where the greatest threat to her reign had fallen. It was a fitting backdrop to the choice before him. He swallowed. For so long, his life had revolved around vengeance. Now, he had a chance at something else, maybe forging peace, maybe forging something new with the alien queen who'd once been his mortal enemy. The memory of their battles and their kisses flashed through his mind, an unbreakable chain linking them. He stepped toward her, ignoring the battered soldiers around them, ignoring the swirling alarms in the distance. Zyra, he said softly, brushing the back of his hand against hers. She stiffened, then relaxed, letting him intertwine their fingers. I'll stay. But not as a prisoner. Not as an enemy. As your equal. Her luminous markings flared in a final display of brilliance. She nodded, and a breath escaped her lips, almost a sigh of relief. My king, then, she said, half smiling, though tears, if Tselek tears existed, threatened to fill her eyes. And just like that, the unstoppable force met the immovable object, not in battle, but in a fragile moment of mutual surrender. A hush fell over the tower as the Tselek soldiers realized what was happening. Their queen, triumphant yet bowed by emotion, stood hand in hand with the human she had once condemned to die. A new chapter began in the ashes of war. Zyra raised her head, voice carrying through the chamber in a proclamation that left no room for doubt. He is no longer my prisoner. He is my consort. My king. The final echoes of conflict faded, leaving them both on the precipice of an uncertain future, one that was theirs to shape, together.